All right, so hopefully you guys had a lovely day on Tuesday. I was very sad without you. Actually, I was at the Continuous Improvement Conference for Leander ISD. I did a presentation um, about how to deal with kids that have scary pictures in their Zoom call things. No, it wasn't about that at all. It's about something else, not related to teaching online. Thank goodness, because clearly, yeah, technology and I are not best friends. But you have some teachers that know all kinds of stuff about technology, so you get some bonuses there. That's good. All right, so we need to talk about weekly questions and general stuff. Weekly questions are due tomorrow, and you've got 4 of them, so hopefully you've done a couple of them. And I'll try to grade some tonight. I should be able to get to some. I graded some last night, but not your class for some reason. Sorry. I didn't mean to skip you, but I'll work on your class tonight. What else I want to say? Quiz should be available. If you have trouble with the quiz, let me know. If you had trouble during the day and sent me an email, I teach most of the day on Tuesday and Thursday, so I probably just haven't had a chance to look at it. But I will, or you can tell me. But I think the quiz is available. It's got 20 questions, so it's a little bigger. If you look at the stuff to study, that'll help you, I'm pretty sure. Still expectation that you'll finish it in an hour, but it's not, I mean, it's not super big. If you have trouble with the time, the amount of time, let me know. And I'll give you a survey about the quiz after you finish the quiz. I don't mean the second after, I mean I'll post it this weekend. So if you can take it before the next class, that would be good. And the weekly questions, the ones for the upcoming units, are posted in the course documents section. All right, you guys have any questions before we get started talking about, weekly question number 4 and the Great Depression and New Deal. Any questions? And you don't have to say no, you can though, it's fine. I'm gonna look for the weekly questions. Surely I have those. Apparently I don't. Huh, how could I not have those? I know you guys don't know the answer, by the way. Let me find. Dang it, Serna. I know why, because I was so busy trying to post those videos. I forgot to post Tuesday's videos, so sorry about that. I know we didn't have one, but I finished posting those today. Sorry for yawning at you. Weekly questions, there we go. Let me open those. And then what's the other thing we need? Notes. We need lecture notes, don't we? Okay, all right. It says welcome back. That's so friendly. It's nice how friendly Microsoft products are, isn't it? Okay, all right. Sorry that I'm having trouble. So weekly questions, you've seen them before probably. So our question for today is to identify the changes in American politics and society brought about by the New Deal. Mention laws, specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. If I were you, and I'm not, but if I were, I would talk about, pick a few New Deal programs that do different sorts of things. Maybe pick one that creates jobs, maybe pick one that regulates parts of the economy, maybe pick one that just hands stuff out, maybe pick one that creates electricity for people in the country, but pick a couple of New Deal agencies, maybe 2 or 3, and talk about them as part of how change in laws. Philosophies, I would say in general, you want to talk about how people are starting to think that the government has a responsibility to fix or potentially change or improve the economy, which is new. And Foner talks a lot about that in this chapter, about how the government's starting to see basic freedom as a freedom from economic want, that sort of thing. So you're starting to see the federal government assume responsibility for the economy or intervening and fixing the economy where they really hadn't been an expectation before. You could also, as far as philosophy, talk about economic philosophy of John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, who's the British economist who thinks that the government needs to have planned deficits to overcome a national depression. So that the government, being the only entity that could really intentionally go into debt in such a way, has the responsibility to do this in order to get people out of a depression. And then politicians, clearly you got to talk about FDR, right? If you answer this question, you don't mention FDR, am I going to have a problem with that? Yes, of course I'm going to have a problem with that. What are you thinking? Yeah, I have a problem with that for sure. So make sure you talk about FDR at the very least. If you want, you can contrast Herbert Hoover with FDR, or you could talk about some of the people who disagree with the New Deal, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. All right. Do you have any questions and or comments about the weekly question? Oh, sorry. All right. I'm taking that as a no, and I'll open the notes. Maybe. Timed question, weekly question, notes. Here we go. All right, notes. I don't recall where we stopped, but I feel like it was right around here with the chart. So, chart has New Deal agencies. I know I've mentioned to you more than once, and you've probably got a list of stuff to study, but be sure you know CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, the one that gave the young dudes jobs, took them out of the city where they were just roaming around causing trouble like unemployed young dudes will do, and took them out into the country, national parks and forests, to build bridges, parks, playgrounds, ranger stations, roads, do flood control, forestry management, that sort of stuff. And they got paid a little, more money got sent back to their families, so most of them thought that was a pretty good deal. The AAA and NRA, in part because they both get declared unconstitutional, both give the federal government control over parts of the economy. The AAA, 3 A's, agricultural part, NRA, National Recovery Administration, the industrial part. So work codes, regulated wages, limited hours, that sort of stuff, but in ways that the Supreme Court was slightly uncomfortable with. And I think, in general, you should know about Social Security. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. All right. So, sorry, I'm looking at my little computer thing and trying to find what time it is. I see it now. Your faces were covering up my time. All right. New Deal programs. 2 phases of the New Deal, hundreds of programs. Certainly your book doesn't list all of them, and you don't need to know all of them, but if you know a few of them, it's pretty good. Phase 1 and phase 2 of the New Deal are just really referred to as the first New Deal and the second New Deal. When you answer your question, you don't necessarily have to distinguish between the 2 phases of the New Deal, but you could if you wanted to. The first New Deal is first year stuff, and it's really primarily about relief. How do we try to end the suffering of the American people, create jobs, that kind of stuff. So these are more temporary fixes potentially. So although there's a little bit of reform kind of thrown in there. So Emergency Banking Act and creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, that clearly is a longer term thing. We still have the results of that act. And this is going to regulate how stock is traded, how corporations are formed, how their stock is sold, how banks and stockbrokers can interact, that sort of thing. And the SEC is going to be a permanent regulatory agency, it's still around, that makes sure that whatever regulations there are regarding stocks and stock trading, the stock market, that those are enforced. CCC, we've mentioned several times, incredibly popular. even with people who aren't really sure that the New Deal is a good idea, when they think, maybe it's too invasive. They might think that, because some people do. NRA and AAA will be declared unconstitutional, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But in general, because the Supreme Court thinks it provides for too much government regulation of private industry, and maybe regulation of intrastate commerce within one state, which is not a right of the federal government. And unemployment, in spite of first New Deal, remains really high. 20% is really high. I think right now we're at about 8 to 10%, which is really high. 20% is twice as high as really high. There were some states, especially Great Plains states, northern farming states, where unemployment was as high, sorry, I'm looking at my phone, as high as 50%. And this wasn't one of those deals where, you know what, taking the unemployment check is more fun, or I think that job's not good enough for me. There's no job. There are just no jobs. It's not even, I don't want to take a bad job. There's not even a bad job to take. So lots of difficulties during this time period, and maybe things are improved by the Great Depression, by the New Deal, but the New Deal doesn't solve the issues of the Great Depression. And even people who think the New Deal was like a fabulous program don't believe that. Do you know that you probably do know, you hear people argue about politics from time to time, but there's some people who think the New Deal was a terrible thing for the United States. Terrible. I have some relatives like that, I'm sure, because I see them post from time to time on social media. Second New Deal. Works Progress Administration, which really just creates a lot of jobs. If you look at the chart above, the WPA is kind of like the PWA, Public Works Administration, only. The goal of the WPA is to create as many jobs as possible. The PWA was really to do a very good job on whatever they created. So sometimes projects of the WPA were not seen as very high quality. There's always a reference to some program, WPA program, where they had 2 shifts of workers each day. The first shift of workers dug holes. The second shift of workers was paid to fill those holes back in. And then the next day, they dug the holes again and filled them back in. So people thought sometimes that the WPA had very wasteful projects. So they would refer to it sometimes as we putter around. We waste time, essentially. The Wagner Act replaces the NRA to creates the permanent EEOC and the other thing, minimum wage. Social Security, I assume you know what Social Security is, but I don't know for sure. You pay into it when you have a job, so you've probably noticed that. It's like, why don't I get that tax back with my refund? You get that tax back when you're old, maybe. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And the REA, Rural Electrification Agency. And the goal of this is to have flood control, but also to add electricity to every farm community in the country. And they're very successful at this. So let's make sure that my people get electricity, and honestly, probably your people too, because this part of Central Texas was very rural during this time period. So it creates agencies like PEC that give electricity to rural areas. I have trouble saying rural country areas. All right, people who didn't like the New Deal, and one of these guys is going to essentially be the founder of Social Security. So we'll talk about Social Security in that mix. Okay, I'm checking to make sure I haven't missed a question. And you could read a book about any of these people if you liked for your book review. Oh, somebody asked, I don't know if I mentioned this, somebody asked if you had to do the book review, is it a required assignment? And to me, the answer is no, except if you'd like to have an A, then the answer is yes. So it's mostly not required, but if you want an A, you have to do it to get an A. And then the other question was, if I do it, is it extra credit? Yeah, essentially. Worth up to 20 points. And let's say that you got a 68 average, like you seem to consistently get about 68% of the points. I think I'd do the book review if I were you. So that way it'll bump you up, more comfortably into the 70 range. You know what I'm saying? So it's not the only reason to do it is to get an A. That is a reason. That can be helpful for other reasons as well. All right. So again, book review on Huey. You could read a book on Huey Long. Would be very interesting. Francis Townsend, probably not as interesting. Charles Coughlin, probably more interesting. So Huey Long's kind of a crazy politician, a little judgmental there. Sorry, from Louisiana. And if you could do something corrupt as a politician, Huey Long probably did it twice at least. He campaigned for FDR in the South when he ran for president in 32 because FDR was concerned that he wouldn't get a lot of Southern votes because he's one of those nice New York kind of dudes who aren't always as popular in the South as you might think. So Huey Long campaigns for FDR in the 1932 campaign and is very successful, so much so that he starts to think, I bet I could run for president. So he decides that he might do that in 1936, and then he would challenge FDR for the Democratic nomination, which he doesn't, well, mostly because he gets shot. However, he's the founder of something called the Share Our Wealth Society. And the thought behind the Share Our Wealth Society was that the federal government was really not doing enough to help the average person, especially country people. So the best way to help the average person would be to give them guaranteed amount of money, a guaranteed annual income, and a certain amount of money to purchase a house. You see similar proposals, I guess, in the modern era. Not usually in the United States. You certainly see them in more democratic socialist countries. But that fellow Andrew Yang, who ran for the Democratic nomination, talked about a guaranteed annual income as well. So it's not a completely foreign conversation in the United States. If you were wondering, would $5,000 be enough for a nice house in the 1930s? Yeah, no, it'd be a pretty snazzy little house. Not like super fancy, like country club house, but maybe, college professor at ACC house. It'd be fine. $2,500 annual income was definitely more than the average person made. So it's not wealth, but it's enough to sustain you in a decent lifestyle. So it's a nice amount of money. Not, where you're wealthy, but still a nice amount to live on. And if you're wondering, how would they pay for that? Are you wondering that? You should always wonder that. Huey Long said, we'll just take the money away from millionaires. Not necessarily people inherited their money, although they would limit inheritance, but anybody whose annual income was over $1 million, that amount over $1 million would be taxed at 100%. So if you made $1,500,000, your tax on that $500,000 would be $500,000. I mean, at least it made the math easy, right? If you're wondering, was that a popular idea? Yes, yes, it was. Because I think that was an era where people weren't as optimistic as you young people are. I know how you young people are. Right now you're thinking, I don't know why she's teaching history. I would never work for that lame amount of money. I'm going to be a whatever you're going to be, and I'll be a millionaire before I'm 30. Now, honestly, I hope that works out for you, because millionaire before you're 30 would be kind of cool. It would. For most of us, it's not exactly the way it works. During this time period, nobody thought that was the way it was going to work because it's the Great Depression. So nobody's thinking, this is going to blow over and in a few years I'll be a millionaire. If you're a millionaire during this time period, people were upset with you because you probably scammed somebody or you're taking advantage of everybody else's misery. Nobody's congratulating you. I'm just saying. So confiscating your wealth, they're fine with it. It's like, you shouldn't have it anyway, you dog. You must have done something you shouldn't have done to get the money. So Huey Long's ideas were pretty popular. He also was a very charismatic fellow. People seemed to be interested in him politically. Oh, sorry for the giant yawn right in the middle. The Democrats thought he was a dangerous fellow, and were hoping that he would not run against FDR in 1936. He decides to run for Senate. He had been governor of Louisiana. Excuse me, sorry. He decides to run for Senate and is successful. And then, leaving a Senate committee hearing one night, he gets killed. Your book talks about this some. The person who gets convicted had been political adversary from Louisiana, who was apparently taking some revenge on him. There were lots of people who speculated that, people had paid that guy to do it, but whatever happened, Huey Long is out of the picture, and this doesn't exactly happen, although kind of, shapes a little bit of the debate about what sort of aid is acceptable and what sort isn't. Dr. Francis Townsend was a medical doctor, lived in California. When he got a little older, in his 60s, he got cancer and somehow was able to recover. This is not an era where medical treatments were terribly effective for cancer. I know some of you are going like, they're not great now, but also there are certain types of cancer, even with very difficult, I know the treatments are difficult, but there are some that are much more survivable than others. But in that era, pretty much if you had cancer, you're going to die. So Townsend survives, and he's also a little older than the average person. During that time period, the average life expectancy was right about 60. So Dr. Townsend survives cancer, and then he says, you know what? I've two big observations. One, I am older than most people, and most people who are old are still working. So old people should stop working. And two, old people are still working because they don't have any money. So we need to give them money for living expenses and potentially health care in case they get sick the way that he had gotten sick. So he is going to suggest an old age pension, $200 a month, required Americans who accepted that pension to stop working. They had to spend the money each month. They couldn't save it. So it had to be enough to pay for their basic needs, but not so much that they'd be tempted to just save it. And this would get them out of the workforce and create new job openings for younger people. So this is what's going to turn into Social Security. And I guess we should talk a little more at length about Social Security. So when Social Security was designed, you could retire at age 62 and get your pension. Life expectancy was closer to 60. So part of the reason they decided 62 is not everybody lived to be 62. So that way they wouldn't have to pay for everyone to have an old age pension. The thought was also that you would pay in a little bit each month, approximately 7% of your income, and your employer would match that 7%. That money would go into a fund where the money was taken out for the current old people who are getting the pension. And then the extra part of the money would be saved for later on for other old people, in case that there would be a certain time where there were so many old people taking out that there weren't enough young people paying in. So it's a pretty well designed, pretty basic, simple pension program. So the things that work well about it, well, I mean, it does take older people out of the job market. It does create a small, stable income for senior citizens. But here's a shocking thing. The Congress, rather than keeping the extra money that they weren't spending on older people pensions, they put it into the general budget and spent it. So since the creation of Social Security in 1935, no Congress has ever saved the extra money. So When this first started, for every one person who got a pension, there were 5 people paying in. I think now there's about 2.5 people paying in for every one who's taking out. Part of that is because the population is aging. That baby boom generation is enormous, and a bunch more of them will retire in the next 5 years. And some of the other generations are really small. Mine is really small. Um, I think yours is much bigger than mine. So, you know, your parents were optimistic, so that's really good. I'm glad they had you. Um, However, there's going to be a point where the ratio is for every one person, every 2 people paying in, there's 1 person taking out. And if that gets worse, you might as well just put an old person in your house. You know what I'm saying? So because we haven't invested this, because people live longer, and they really haven't raised the age at which you can retire in a substantial way. Because then it was 62. Now I think you can do extra or early retirement at 62, standard at 65, and then deferred at 67. And the longer you wait, the more money you get, but it's still a pretty small pension. So, but it's still a pension. So it's something you can count on, at least in that era. I'm not your financial advisor, but I can tell you what mine said. Don't count on Social Security. And that wasn't just because I actually am a teacher and haven't paid in. It's not a good thing to count on anyway. So, all right. But it's created during this time period, and in its early days is run pretty well, even though they didn't save the money they were supposed to save. So, all right. And for Father Charles Coughlin was a radio priest. He had a radio show. His family was from Ireland. He emigrated to Canada, then to the United States. And he had about 30 million listeners, which is a very big radio show, would be an enormous one now. But in a time period where there's maybe 90, 100 million working adults, it's a really big talk show back then. Coughlin was a huge supporter of Roosevelt in 32. But once Roosevelt got elected, he thought that Roosevelt was not doing a very good job of supporting the poorest people. He thought instead that his money or his efforts were really much more helpful to big businessmen, bankers, Wall Streeters, as he would say. And he also will point out later on that most of those people are Jewish. So he says that FDR is kind of in the pockets of the Jews. So he's going to be anti-Semitic, which will fit in, unfortunately, a little too well with this time period. So you'll see more of that than you might imagine. The Supreme Court is going to declare the NRA and the AAA to be unconstitutional because they said that Congress had given some of its regulatory powers to the executive branch through these acts. And then in some instances, especially the New York case called I think Schenkter versus New York, which was the sick chicken case. The poultry establishment that they were regulating did not sell chickens outside of the state of New York. So the Supreme Court is going to rule in that instance, because it's intrastate within one state, the federal government has no standing at all. FDR's response to that was to lose his temper. And he said, you know what? You guys don't know what you're talking about because you're old. Dang old people, you can't ever trust them. So he wanted to reform or reorganize the Supreme Court. So his Supreme Court reform plan would have allowed him to replace, well, let me start again. It's not exactly replace. It said that if you were age 70, there were 2 options for you as a Supreme Court justice. One, retire, so the president can pick a new guy who understands the world better than you do, because those old guys were out of touch. Or 2, the president can add an extra judge for anyone who's 70 or older who refuses to retire. So this would have given FDR the opportunity to add 5 or 6 new judges. So This was referred to as court packing, which you're hearing some people talk about now. Up until probably the last 2 weeks, when we said court packing, we meant adding extra Supreme Court justices. We've been at 9 for 100, 120 years. It's been a while since we had 8 or 7. So Supreme Court packing really refers to adding new judges, new spots for judges to the Supreme Court, not replacing old ones. Although certainly the Democrats have a new definition of court packing, and I'm not saying it's illegitimate. I'm saying it's a different definition. So the American public did not agree with FDR's plan, neither did the Congress, so it didn't pass. They thought that his plan would give him too much power, so they didn't want to do that. However, after he suggested the Supreme Court reform plan, the court kind of changes how it sees New Deal agencies and freedom or liberty. They begin to see that the federal government may actually have a responsibility in upholding the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the American population. And the court is not going to declare any more New Deal agencies to be unconstitutional. So FDR really, after he threatens or suggests the Supreme Court reform plan or court packing, as it were, the court doesn't do anything that he doesn't want them to do after that. He also, and the book will point this out, he also will get to replace eventually 6 of those judges. They'll either pass away or retire. But FDR serves a lot longer than the average president. He gets elected to 4 terms and serves 3 full terms and then about half a year of that 4th one. So he gets to replace a lot of judges. Now your current president, I think, is replacing his 3rd one, which is really unusual for, in one presidency. All right, I'm going to stop for a second, see if you have any questions, and then we'll go back to the rest of it. If you guys have any questions, anything you want to ask? Sorry, by the time I'm to your class, it's the 3rd one of the day. I have talked so much. And I live by myself, so I don't go around talking very much. Not going to lie. If I were about 10 years older and lived by myself, I would probably talk a lot more. What we do as we get older. All right, you guys have grandparents, All right. So the New Deal changes a lot of things, and then there's some other things it doesn't really change, okay? Anything related to race or ethnicity, if you're thinking all that's going to improve, too soon. Hang on to that thought for another 10 or 15 years historically, okay? All right, conservation is going to become more important. Not necessarily for its own sake, but we had a phenomenon called the Dust Bowl that happens primarily in the middle of the country, which was a drought, which affected the soil in a very negative way because farmers had really overfarmed. They'd overused the soil. So the soil there wasn't anything that rooted it down, and it was stripped of its nutrients. So when we had the drought, what literally happened is the topsoil blew away. So until that topsoil is naturally replaced, they're not going to be able to grow very much stuff. So they are going to have a social conservation service, WPA tree planting activities, restoration of eroded land. They're going to dam rivers. So there are going to be a lot of government projects to try to restore and improve soil conservation in the middle of the country. And this is primarily for economic reasons, but I think we're better about noticing this in the modern era, that conservation and the economy really go well together. They do. Now, this is not a thing where they're trying to ban fracking or we're not going to use fossil fuels or anything like that, but they are noticing, when the topsoil blows away, you do notice that there's a problem. And that era of drought is followed by an era of flooding as well. So it's really hard on the environment. farms are not very productive. People actually move away from them. And in, 6 or 8 years, they'll start to move back. So women will be more important politically, sometimes on purpose, sometimes incidentally. I don't want to say it's an accident, but FDR will hire the first female Secretary of Labor, who is Frances Perkins. You could read a book about her. It'd be moderately interesting. He also hires Mary McLeod Bethune, who's a fairly famous educator, as the head of the National Youth Administration, which is part of the WPA. She's one of the co-founders of Bethune-Cookman College, which is a big education school in DC. Also, she's African American. I probably didn't mention that, and I don't know how you'd know, unless you just knew. Eleanor Roosevelt is a part of this as well, recognizing she's not elected to anything, but she is really the first lady who gives herself stuff to do. So she says, I'm first lady, I'm going to make a difference. And she really advocates on the behalf of lots of people. She's really big into anti-poverty movements. So she really wants to improve conservation. She wants to improve education. She wants to improve infrastructure, roads and bridges and schools and things like that in impoverished communities, traditionally impoverished communities, especially for her, the Appalachian region, which is one of the poorest regions in the country, kind of in the east near the Appalachian Mountains. She also is really big on children's health issues, health for minors, MINERS, not little kids, although she wants to help children as well. But in the mining regions of the Appalachians as well, lung diseases, lung disorders that go along with those jobs. And she's, sorry. Also, it's not gonna work. Oh. Sorry. Also big on civil rights. And the way that you really saw that in this era, she was a member of Daughters of the American Revolution, which means you can trace your legacy or your roots back to the founding of the country. This is typically old wealthy families in the United States, and certainly the Roosevelts qualified. One of the years when she was First Lady, the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, were holding their annual meeting in Philadelphia, and they had asked Marian Anderson to come sing, who was a very famous singer, but again, it's radio era, so not as many movies just yet. So not everyone, apparently the person who booked her, realized she was Black. She's a pretty famous opera singer of the time period, but you would hear her on the radio, you would hear her music on the radio as well. So at some point they realized this and they rescind the offer to her to come sing. They say, you can't come here because that hall is segregated and you can't come. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt read about this and she quit the DAR. She said, I'm not going to be part of this racist organization, and arranged for Marian Anderson to do a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which was pretty, well publicized and certainly broadcast as well. So between that and the appointment of other African Americans to the FDR administration, people started to think that maybe at least a person, if not a party, was starting to be a little more on their side. African Americans were included in New Deal programs, although very rarely on equal footing. The NRA allowed different pay scales for Black and white workers, which led to an alternate nickname for this program, which the NAACP and certain African American leaders would refer to as Negro robbed again. I will say that this is in an era where that word was an appropriate description for African Americans. So I would not suggest to you that it is currently. I assume that you know this, but just in case, I'm mentioning that. So alternate nickname for the program, business and Southern pressure allowed large classifications to be exempted from Social Security. So employers who employed farm workers or domestic workers, people who cleaned your house, did your laundry, cooked your food, took care of your kids, you didn't have to pay for their Social Security. So they weren't eligible for Social Security. And these tended to be the poorest workers in the country. And in certain regions of the country, these were Black or brown workers. So, and the book has an interesting section, I think, where they talk about how some New Deal programs, the ones that really did help African Americans and people of color more directly, were stigmatized as being immoral or amoral. So it's a really interesting, slightly depressing section of the book, I'm sure. And it mentions that if you're African American, you're often last hired and first fired. But FDR did have a group of Black advisors that he referred to as the Black Cabinet, which included Mary McLeod Bethune, but also William Hastie and Robert Weaver. And he sometimes listened to them, sometimes didn't. I mean, took their advice, but always listened to them. So what you will see as a result of the Marian Anderson stuff and New Deal starting, I mean, helping African Americans, but maybe not equally, but at least providing some assistance, is that African Americans who had traditionally always voted for Republicans are going to start to vote for Democrats, which is really interesting in an era where in the South, the Klan members also vote for Democrats. Now, you remember as well that African Americans in the South aren't voting at all. They just aren't. The Indian New Deal reverses the Dawes Act, so you don't have to stay on the reservation, go to boarding school. We don't all have to farm our own little land. But this is 50 years after Dawes was passed. So the culture has been altered pretty dramatically. So it restores tribal autonomy, but also takes away funding. And it does this in the middle of the Great Depression. So you're not going to see a lot of changes immediately because of the Indian New Deal. I guess the biggest change you see is automatic citizenship. The side effects of that are not immediate. Once there are more court cases, maybe. And then you see the big changes regarding tribal autonomy happening more in the 1960s and 70s. So talk about that later. Time period where Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants are going to be deported in very large numbers. And I know we've talked generally about Mexican immigration before. In eras where people are doing well, that they're prospering and the economy is good, we tend to be okay with Mexican immigration. And when the economy is bad, we tend to want to build a wall and deport people. So this is an era where the economy is bad and the federal government is going to work very hard to deport people. So the book talks about how there were immigration sweeps and lots of local encouragement to get Mexicans to leave the country. Immigration sweeps were not encouraging. It wasn't encouragement at all. They would go and essentially arrest Mexican Americans who could not prove that they were from the United States, couldn't prove it on the spot, and then would give them the free train trip to Mexico City. We're going to deport nearly 500,000 Mexican Americans, many of whom had never lived anywhere but the United States, just were unable to prove at that moment that they were US citizens, which would be a difficult thing to prove in that era because you wouldn't have had driver's license, no social security card, certainly no green card or anything like that, or birth certificate, which would be the ultimate thing that would prove your citizenship. Nobody carries those around. People were also okay talking about communism and socialism because the economy was so bad. Communist and socialist parties typically ran candidates in local and state elections, Socialist Party more in national elections. In the 30s, we had Socialist Party governors, Upton Sinclair being most notable in California. After World War II, Stalin kind of makes socialism/communism not look so cool. And these people who had openly been socialist and communist are going to be targets of some stuff after World War II. But those things were okay during this era because the economy was so bad. everyone was talking about ways to fix it. And last but not least, and you could read a book about any of the individuals mentioned in this dot, Dorothea Lange, who's really famous photographer of the time period. Her photography is paid for by the New Deal projects. And almost all of the migrant farm worker pictures that you've ever seen were probably taken by Dorothea Lange. New Deal programs to record the stories of former slaves and popular film of the era really promoted, dignified, celebrated the contribution of the common man. So art during this time period is going to reflect more day-to-day experiences. And you see that from time to time in art history or just history. Charles Hamilton Houston is going to be the founder of Howard University Law School. He was a graduate of Harvard University Law School and decided to start a law school at Howard University because it was a traditionally Black college. And the goal of that law department was to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. His most famous student and probably most important student would have been Thurgood Marshall. Charles Hamilton Houston will also head the legal team for the NAACP and certainly be the mentor to Thurgood Marshall. He would be a fascinating person to read a book about. Paul Robeson's primarily an entertainer of the time period, although he had a law degree from Cornell. He also had played professional sports. So he earned his money as an opera singer, which is a weird combination of skills, but was so popular during that era that if he was going to give a concert, did I mention he's an African-American man? I probably didn't. But if he was going to give a concert, he demanded that the audience be integrated or he wouldn't give the concert. So he's going to be the only entertainer of the time who requires that his audience is integrated, and he will get that. In the 30s and 40s, he's going to push for workers' rights. And then after World War II is over, he's really going to be labeled a communist, and they will strip him of his passport and in a lot of ways his ability to make a living. He gets blacklisted. And in a lot of ways, he kind of gets written out of the historical record. But he would be somebody really worth reading about too. People have started to write about him more in the modern era. So you start to see some changes during this time period, but the Scottsboro Boys incident reminds you that those changes are not very thorough. I think I've talked about this before. This is where the homeless guys hop on trains to go from one town to another to get jobs. They call those guys hobos during this time period. They would self-segregate, so you'd have a boxcar of Black hobos, a boxcar of white hobos. In this instance, there were also some hobo prostitutes who were going from car to car selling their services. They end up getting caught in Alabama, Scottsboro, Alabama. And when they get arrested, they are in the Black hobo car, or the hobo car with African Americans in it. And they will claim that they had been raped rather than doing this as a service or as a profession, so they don't get in trouble. What ends up happening is, I think it's 7 of these people in this car get sentenced to death. Now, the women will recant their story, but it's going to take over a decade before these guys get out of jail, and at least one of them dies in jail. So terribly, terribly tragic story. All right, dang, that was hard, get all that stuff done. Now, before you run off, I'm going to see if you have any questions and just double check the roll, because I think I got everybody in, because the last 2 people that weren't here when we started had come in. So, all right. There's a lot of talking. Do you guys have any questions you want to ask before you go? Now remember, all this stuff's due essentially midnight tomorrow, but I know you have it all done because you were off on Tuesday, right? I hope so. I hope you got either caught up on sleep or caught up on work, whichever one you needed most. So. All right, if you have questions, ask them. If not, feel free to say goodbye. I wish you good luck as you complete your work. Thank you for coming. Have a lovely day. Okay, and somebody's going to stay at the end to ask about book review, so feel free to stay and ask questions if you like. If you don't want to ask questions, go away, and then she can ask the question. Oops, I revealed at least it's a female, so you want to do that? Sorry.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Have a good afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, you too.
Oh, thank you, you too.
Okay, so I wanted to do a book on the OK Corral, and I wanted to know if that would be okay.
You know, I don't remember when that is, but I feel like it's 1870s or something.
It's 1881.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's kind of weird and specific. I don't mean that, I don't mean anything like your choice is weird. It's sort of a weird event, but no, that's fine. It is. The only thing that I would probably, well, no, just read it and I don't know. I think it should be fine. It'd be kind of cool if you could figure out what impact or what that was indicative of the time period, you know, like how does that fit into the time period? Is it a sign that the West is kind of lawless and you still take the law into your own hands? Or is that a sign that the West is starting to calm down? Or, I don't know, maybe you'll get to some conclusion like that, but you may not. I mean, whoever wrote the book will have a reason they wrote the book. So just make sure you read the foreword, but it should be good. Yeah, it should be fine.
All right, yeah, I just wanted to confirm.
Nope, you're good.
All right, bye.
Bye, thank you. Matthew, do you have some question? Or are you just working on pre-cal? Oh crap, Matthew. I'm sorry, I'm still recording too, so that's gonna come out on the recording.
It's fine, I don't really mind.
Thank you, I'm sorry.